She put a pot on she hair and gone. Them a the first one out on the dam. Basket on she head, bucket in each hand, hold up on she frack, I wanna she grandson. To the market, them a go. For the morning, the day is dawning. For Catacrow to give the villagers a warning. Rise and shine, the birds them a sing. All animal take turn as them join in the waking. Catacrow, Dagaba, donkey bray, horse and they even duck a quack. Catacrow, Dagaba, donkey bray, horse and they even duck a quack. Come and hear this sweet story that tell the people about life in the country. All day a back now, me now a come home. Inaga, jackass yard to fetch a load. Cockle shy hand, bag over shoulder, running by his side, a Rexy and Rover. From the farm, them a come. Sun a go down, but up the river. Some washing clothes, some folks are bathing at the water. Fisherman, they catch them a bring. From a canoe boat, man, them start offloading. Aymara, Kwakwari, Gale Baka Kuma Kuma, even Lokunani. Aymara, Kwakwari.
You know, good night, everybody. There's a reason why I allowed that song to play for a few minutes, because lots of people have been saying, "Hey, where do we get a copy of this song? Where can we get a copy of this song?" It's beautiful, especially those who grew up in the country. I'm not picking on anybody who hasn't had some time or experience in the country. I know you've had that experience, particularly attending Auckline Primary School, but it wasn't Auckline Primary School when you attended it. I knew it as Auckline Primary School. But when you attended, what was it again? The
Auckline Church of Scotland School.
Church of Scotland.
In those days, in the middle of the last century, the schools were identified by religious names. So I went to Communist Moravian School. And there are many Moravians left in the country now. I went to St. John the Baptist Anglican School, and I also went to Sacred Heart Roman Catholic School. And the schools were, although they were for poor people, they were still exclusive. But I certainly went to Auckland Church of Scotland School. You know, even though I was not a Presbyterian, I was always an Anglican.
And attending that, we're talking specifically Auckline Primary School. Before we say, let's just say goodnight to all of our listeners, wherever you're listening to us, watching us from, whether on the quarantine, Linden, Georgetown, Bartica, Lethem, wherever. Even folks out in Oriala do watch us too. Oriala, good night to all of you. Orialians. How many of you have ever gone to Oriala? But let's get back to Auckline Primary School when you attended it. What about the prayers? Y'all had prayers there every morning?
Yes, but it was typical because these were church schools. The schools were actually run by members of that denomination, and we started with prayers. You know, I remember speaking to a Muslim Nigerian. You know, I asked him, you know, how can you say 5 prayers a day? He said, how many prayers you say in the Christian schools? Then I realized that, you know, when you got in school, you prayed. Before you went to lunch, you prayed. When you got back after lunch, you prayed. When you left, so that's 4 prayers. And if you had to say prayers at home when you woke up and before you went to bed, you end up saying 6 prayers per day. So the Muslims say we just the same as Christians. So I have no, you know, many Muslims look, you know, say their prayers faithfully, but certainly all of the schools I went, all of the primary schools I went to, we said prayers when you arrived, and if not at lunchtime, when you left. It's only when I went to secondary school that we stopped the saying prayers.
Well, I had to take myself and a few other boys, and maybe 1 or 2 girls. We had to say an extra prayer, especially when we when we get a message that the headmistress needs to see us. So we said an extra prayer. Or some of those teachers, good headmistress, the late Norma Stewart, and good teachers like Mr. Tyndall, and all those other good teachers, Dasrat and so forth. We said the prayers before we reached their office because we knew exactly what was that, right? President Granger, good to see you again this week. I asked you, there was a reason why I asked you about those prayers and Auckland School, the name prior to what we know it today as Auckland Primary School. And those who don't know where Auckland Primary School is, it's located on the Quarantine, region number 6. It's between Letterkenny Village, right when you pass Bloomfield, and after Bloomfield is Letterkenny. You continue going east, and then after Letterkenny is Auckland, and after Auckland is Wim Village. Then you have Lancaster, Liverpool, then you have Manchester, then you have Ulverston, then you have Alness, then you have Big Alice, then you have Salton, then you have Oxton. We can go on.
You're giving your viewers a geography lesson on Region 6.
Yes, absolutely.
But those who have never gone there. And who will never go there.
Norney, Limnair, Kildonan, Bushlat, Farm, Maida, Kilmarnock, Philippi, Cromarty. Then there was Tarla G2, and then you get 35 Village, and you go on and on, Brighton.
What you're saying is not just geography, Mark. You're speaking history there because a lot of those names are Scottish, Kilmarnock and Auckland. And this is the reason why there's such a proliferation of Presbyterian or Scottish churches in the Quarantine particularly. I think when we claim our reparations, we must particularly approach the people in Scotland to pay reparations for all those plantations they enslaved our forefathers on.
And I forget Cromarty too. Cromarty. A lot of times, and even Albion, because when you go to England, or you don't have to go to England, but you see some places out in England like Albion, Manchester, and even in Scotland, right? Auckland, these villages, the names of these villages, they're right there. Kilmarnock,
Edinburgh, Glasgow.
Yeah. But what was it like though? Because Auckland Primary School, going back in your days, and the prayers, the Christian prayers. I know Wim. The reason why I'm asking that, because Auckland Primary School, you have the entire Wim village. Majority are persons of East Indian descent. Then you have Letterkenny, same thing. Then you have Bloomfield and so forth. What was it like for little kids who weren't Christians saying a Christian?
As I said, the schools were run by churches, and they attracted persons who belonged to those denominations. And by the time I got there, of course, they had evangelized many of the Indians. And as you know very well from your own experience, many of the Indians on the Quarantine actually adhered to Presbyterian churches, the Lutheran churches. I think there's a heavy concentration of Lutheran and Presbyterian churches in the Quarantine. So many of them were easily admitted to the schools and churches. And at the time I was there, the headmaster was Natu. And of course, many of the Tamils, for example, for reasons I don't have to go into now, many of the people who are regarded as Tamil, or what we used to call,
Madras.
Madrasis. Many of the Tamils turned to Christianity. Maybe I don't know the internal dynamics in the Hindu in Hindu faith, but I know there were lots of Tamils who were Christians, and even now, a lot of people, sometimes you hear names like Ramsamy and who were from Port Morant or
Veersamy,
Hampshire and those areas are actually Christians. So I think that in the fullness of our discussion to follow, you'll see that the Christian churches deliberately evangelized Indians, although it's not massive, but certainly there was a good percentage of Indians originally of Hindu faith who were converted or who adhered to Christianity. And so it wasn't a problem for them. Many of them became priests. I think one of the most prominent Presbyterian priests was Dr. Dale Bismarck, who became a minister in the PDP government. But, and of course, as you know, the Catholic Church, you had Bishop Benedict Singh. So the lines are blurred, we mustn't assume that every Indian is either Hindu or Muslim, because when you look at the percentage of the population, 64% of the population Christian, many of them are not Africans or Portuguese or Chinese. Many of them are Indians.
Yeah. And I've also learned, and good point there, President Granger. Before we get to our topic, though, I recall even on the quarantine, there's a small percentage of persons of African descent that you shouldn't assume are Christians. Some of them are Hindus, but that's for another talk. Those who know what I'm talking about, good night to that lady. She's probably no longer with us, that lived right at that Alnis Coca. Those of you who used to go down to that dam till down at the waterside, to you guys know what I'm talking about. But good night to all of you, and welcome to Straight Up. I noticed Mr. Granger said, okay, let's move on with tonight's topic. But quick question before we move on. Sorry, I did say that there were. I had to say an extra prayer whenever a mistress calls me into her office or a teacher. Did you ever have to pray that extra prayer too? Or you are nice, quiet boy?
We'll skip that part.
We will skip that part indeed. Again, good night to all of you. Tonight, the public has never failed to acknowledge and appreciate the central role played by the Christian Church in primary and secondary education and in enhancing human development in the post-emancipation and pre-independence era. So that's what we're talking about tonight as we prepare to go into Christmas season and we're softening things down, so to speak. And so Anansi Web Education, the program examines the topic Christianity and the community. Our aim, basically, of explaining the role of the Christian Church in the evolution of modern state. So, President Granger, as you take the first bite of this question, it says, when did Christianity become established in Guyana?
Well, I'm glad to use the word established because, as you know, we were colonized by Christians, the Dutch and then the English. And there's no evidence that they ever abandoned the faith, although they certainly abandoned any notion of charity towards the person they enslaved. But it is evident that, for example, when the Dutch were here, Lutheranism, or the Lutheran Church, to which some of the Dutch adhered, was present, but it was for themselves. It wasn't for the enslaved Africans. So they were Christians, but I would say that it was not until the early years of the 19th century, around 1809 or thereabouts, when the group called the LMS, the London Missionary Society, made its presence felt and of course the first Christians, you can say, who established church for the people, for the masses, were the Congregationalists. The Congregationalists were part of the LMS, the London Missionary Society, which was a group of Protestant churches. But the Congregationalists were part of that group. So when you talk about the establishment, I wouldn't speak about the churches that came to cater for a few planters. When you speak of establishment, I speak of the church that came to deal with the mass of people. And the first church we have to deal with is the Congregational Church, which, of course, established a chapel at Bethel, and of course, the main one at Amsterdam, which is probably the oldest continuous church, which is known as Mission Chapel. But at that time, the Anglicans were really for the planters, and the Scottish were really for the planters, the Presbyterian Church. And of course, even persons of color who attempted to enter those churches were certainly aware of the fact that they were not welcome. They were not welcome, and it was very close to emancipation time in 1838 that colored people were admitted into those churches, particularly the Anglican Church. The Catholics came much later, and they catered mostly for the Portuguese, because the Portuguese immigrants spoke Portuguese, and they sent for their own priests. And I think the Church of the Sacred Heart in Main Street in Georgetown, the early services were conducted in Portuguese and Latin. So when you speak of the establishment of Christianity, I would trace that establishment to the first decade of the 19th century, and I would credit the Congregationalists with the establishment of the church. As you know, the church at Bethel, where the priest was John Smith, was supposed to be involved in the 1823 revolt. So you can see how far back that went. And of course, the so-called martyr, Kwamina, was a deacon in the congregation, in what is now the Congregational Church. And the headquarters of the Congregational Church in Georgetown is called Kwamina House. So that went back to the days before the 1823 revolt. So when you talk about the establishment, I would say Christianity became established in the first decade or the first quarter of the 19th century. That's the answer to your question.
And thank you so much for that answer. And good night to all of you who are now watching us. Tonight we're talking about about Christianity and the community, with the aim of explaining the role of the Christian church in the evolution of the modern state in Guyana. Second question: why did the Christian church construct so many schools across Guyana? We spoke of Auckland. I visited Auckland Primary as a little boy. We had debates there, and then there was Wellington Park Primary as well. And prior to that, that was a Christian name, transformed from that Christian school's name to Wellington Park. I also attended Wellington Park Primary School. That's the village right after Cromarty Village on the current team. So the question, President Granger, why did the Christian church construct so many schools?
It was part of the philosophy of the London Missionary Society and the Congregationalists to educate the African, the enslaved Africans. And I don't wish to be cynical, but it was to help them to read the Bible. I suppose the Bible is the main textbook. And if you want people to understand what's in the Bible, you have to try to make them literate. And it wasn't to make them, accountants and attorneys at law. It was to help them to read the Bible. And I would say that it was part of their mission, the humanitarian mission. There were among the Congregationalists in the LMS, the London Missionary Society, people who really believe that you should know the truth and the truth should make you free. So education was part of the mission of the Christian. And they were supported by the main bodies in Britain. And that helped to finance the church. And of course, the enslaved Africans, they couldn't pay, they had no money, they couldn't support the churches. So the construction and the priests, most of whom came from England at that time, had to be paid by the people in Britain. But the actual construction of the schools, I think, by the Congregationalists was phenomenal. When you consider the church, the schools that were built in late 19th century and the early 20th century. And almost every church was accompanied by a school. It's a practice that I see in Islam, that every masjid, every jamaat, would have a madrasa and a masjid, and they were close together. Not that they must. I don't know what teaching went on in the madrasa, but definitely, in my experience, my first 4 primary schools were all literally a stone's throw in the same compound with the churches. So if I went to Bartica, primary school, there was the St. John the Baptist church, St. John the Baptist. Went to Auckland, across the road was this the Presbyterian church. When I went to Comenius Moravian in Queenstown in Georgetown, the church was in the same yard as the school. And similarly in Sacred Heart, when I went to Sacred Heart, the classes were actually conducted in the church building, in the back of the church building. So it was inseparable. It was inseparable. So it was part of the thinking, part of the philosophy, that the role of the church is not simply to teach the word, but to enable the converts to read the word of God as they saw it in the Bible. So they went together, and they did a tremendous amount of work in education. Whether I wouldn't call it self-interest, but what we know today as the education system in Ghana was built on the foundation of Christian teaching.
All right, our third question. Where has Christianity had its greatest of impact?
I would say that it was countrywide, because although the London Missionary Society and the Congregational churches were very concerned with the enslaved Africans, eventually Catholic missionaries penetrated the hinterland. And the Anglican Church also was very influential, because, at one stage, the Anglicans, because of course, in the early days of Anglicanism in Ghana, the Anglican Church was what was called an established church. So it was supported by the government. And the schools, the 2 schools which were built by, the 2 secondary schools which were built by the Anglicans, Queen's College and Bishops, were supported by the government. It is clear that not only was the Anglican Church involved in evangelizing, the Americans and Africans and Indians, but also you go into some areas in every region, in region 1, sometimes of the rivers, in region 2, in region 3, certainly region 4, 5, and 6, and in region 7, a place like Cameroon, you find a major Anglican church. You have a lot of Seventh-day Adventist church, and perhaps in the whole of region 7, there's a concentration of SDA churches and schools. So the impact was great. Even in the Rupununi, of course, we all remember that tragic Rupununi revolt in 1969. Most of the churches in the Rupununi were Catholic churches. So it was countrywide. There was not a single region in Ghana in which the Christian church did not have a footprint. So I would say the impact, it's hard to measure the impact, of course, because it's the population of Georgetown. You find a lot of churches. But I used to say when I was campaigning that, in some of the villages, if you go to Victoria, if you throw a stone in the air, it will probably land on the church, because there are so many of them. And even in the African villages, it is difficult to find an African village now which does not have 1 or more churches. There are several churches, particularly, well, you probably only have 1 congregational church, but as I said, in all of the villages, you would find several churches. Now, of course, the amount of Pentecostal churches has increased. I suppose 100 years ago, the biggest churches might have been Anglican or Catholic, but now the Pentecostal churches are about 23 or 24% of the population, of the people who claim to be Christians. So that is what has happened now. And I would say that the question of impact has to be measured in terms of the change which is taking place in the Christian community. Although Pentecostals did not build the same amount of schools as the Congregationists, they now constitute a much larger percentage of the population. So the impact being countrywide, but I think the Pentecostals have benefited from people who left the traditional churches, Anglicans and Catholics and maybe Presbyterians, and have gone across to churches where they feel are more lively. And as a result of that, I think the impact has been throughout the country, particularly in the hinterland areas. The churches have been able to attract a lot of indigenous priests and pastors as well. So there's no region in this country, even though some regions have a strong Hindu population, strong Islamic population, there's no region in this country which has not felt the impact of Christian churches.
All right. And for all of you, this President Granger, you recognize this, right? This building?
Well, how could I ever forget Auckland Church of Scotland School?
Yep.
Yeah, that was Auckland. Now they've called it the Auckland Primary School, but the building hasn't changed. It looks like an army barracks, really.
Yep.
It's not a modern school by any means.
I do recall this school. I know it inside out. I didn't attend, but we did debates there. Got lots of friends from there as well. Can't remember many of their names though, but we were all little kids in the, if I say what year, it probably give an idea, but it's the late 70s. The late 70s, early 80s, Auckland Primary School. We debated this school. We beat them. They had some bright kids there too. On the right side is where the second level, that's where the stage is. And that was my favorite spot. The stage, and you see where that little guard hut there? Well, it didn't have that guard hut, but all those ladies selling, like, those were my two favorite spots. Forget about the classrooms, right? Well, I didn't attend there, but yeah, I something about the school. Then opposite the school, there's the church and also the cemetery.
That's right.
Yeah.
I must say that when I went to Auckland, there was no bottom flat.
I was going to ask you that.
That was built later because I have a distinct recollection of being stung by marabuntas in the bottom flat of Auckland Church of Scotland School. Yeah, those days, because of the rainfall, downstairs the ground used to be flooded from time to time. And this was filled in later.
And then, of course, you wouldn't have the motorbikes there. Yeah.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
The headmaster alone had a bicycle. It was a Rudge, a green Rudge. People don't know about Humber Rally and Rudge.
Yeah.
And Hercules.
And as I just go through, I see some of the names too. St. Teresa's Primary, and obviously Christian name, St. Teresa's Primary. These different things, different names, but that's Auckland. Yeah, that's Auckland for you guys. Let's go to our third and second to last question here. It's, what role does Christianity play in everyday society, sir?
Everyday society presumably simply means contemporary society, but historically, Guyanese associated the whole concept of Christianity in the Christian church with emancipation. And I think many people still remember those days, and particularly the Congregationists, the name of the head office building is Kwamina House, and Kwamina is associated with emancipation. So there's still that lingering affection for Kwamina and the role that the congregation played. In terms of the present day or everyday role, the church, as you know, had to take a step back or away from education in 1976 when the government took over the schools. So there is still a strong influence of the church. And now you have Islamic and Hindu schools. So religion is still playing an important role in education. Of course, for a time they were mostly government schools, but now you still have, or you have a resurgence of religious-based schools. And I would say that religion still has a role in public education. In terms of the family, I think there's a tendency when marriages fall into difficulties, there's a tendency to turn to the pastor for counseling, to the church for prayer, in the hope that, prayer and counseling and maybe reference to the religious scriptures would help to correct the problems within failing marriages. I don't know to what extent that is successful, but I know people still rely on the church to hold troublesome or troubled marriages together. Holidays, people are now looking again at do we need things like, I don't know if it's still used, quite frankly, Easter term and Christmas term. Perhaps they want to have more secular names like first term, second term, third term. People, I think in Guyana or any other country, still regard the season that we're into in December 2024, Christmas season. And I don't think that in the Western Hemisphere there's quite anything like Christmas season for simple, family gatherings and jollification. So I think the concept of the Christian holiday is still important. And I think many people are very grateful to the church, and even nowadays, for helping them to get involved in education or to advance in education and to become professionals. Even though the role is diminished, it is certainly still a contributory factor to go to a church school and to seek advancement in life through belief in Christianity. I'm not saying this to suggest that there's any improper relationship between the church and business. I don't know if it's true or not, but I suppose if you have a strong relationship with the church and you go for a job, people want to know what your background was. Nobody is going to go looking for a job and say, I'm a pagan or I'm heathen. And it's no longer valid to ask a person what is your belief, because it should not be relevant, whether you're a Christian or not. But many people would prefer not to describe their belief as being none. They feel that just putting something there, Christian, Anglican or Catholic, might help their employment chances. So I would say that up to the present time in Guyana, there's still that belief that Christianity plays a role. And I think apart from the actual beliefs in what Jesus said and did, his life and death, his mission and his message, I think people still believe that Christianity has infused and imparted certain ethical values. I mean, we all know the 10 Commandments, and those 10 Commandments are commonsensical for most people. Not to steal, not to kill, not to tell lies. And whether you believe in God or not, or whether you believe in Christ's mission or not, there are certain ethical values which Christianity has injected in society, which I believe have made society stronger, made communities stronger. So I would say that it still plays a role. And many people in the country, whether they go to church or not, whether they're true believers or not, um, feel that the lessons, the ethical lessons of Christianity, keep society together. And for that reason, I would say Christianity plays a role still in everyday society. And as long as we intend to live together, we need to adhere to those precepts and those rules, in our relations with one another. Whether a marriage doesn't have to be a Christian marriage, but you just need to have respect between husband and wife and between parents and children. And I suppose that is as much as I could say. Christianity still, Hinduism plays a role, Islam plays a role, but Christianity plays a role in everyday society because it embodies certain ethical principles which are necessary for people to live together in civilized society.
Thank you so much, sir. Takes us to our final question for tonight as we look at the time. Final question. How have villages benefited from the Christian church?
Of course, there are different types of villages. My familiarity with some of the hinterland villages, I would say that the church is indispensable. The Christian church is indispensable. Most of the hinterland villages, that is the villages where a large proportion of the indigenous population, most of those are Christians and they have Christian churches. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And those Christian churches help in education and they help in sort of moral and social cohesion in those churches. As far as the African churches on the coastline and church and African villages on the coastline and even villages occupied by or inhabited by Indians, particularly those Indians who have in quarantine villages like Wim and Hampshire, where a lot of people of Tamil descent live in a very small number of villages, but the Tamil population is concentrated on that part of the quarantine. I would say that they benefited tremendously, and as I said earlier in the program, that, in places like Victoria, Betterboacting, you throw a stone in the air to probably land on a church. So they have benefited historically. I cannot measure the impact of those of the presence of Christian churches in villages today, but there has definitely been a drifting away because the values that are pervaded in popular entertainment and in politics are not necessarily consistent with Christian doctrine. But the villages have benefited. Some of the older folk who are still respected are likely to be the churchgoers. Many younger persons don't see the need to go to church, perhaps, but they fall under the influence of older persons who were influenced by Christianity. So I think the church still has a role, and many persons still feel that the church has helped the community, and it continues to help community solidarity through various ways, like children's groups or sporting groups, social groups, welfare groups. And when we have disasters, as we have had, in 2005, the Great Flood under the PPP administration, and I think in 2021 we had another great flood. I don't know when the next great flood is going to be. But the Christian churches helped the villages, particularly in East Demerara. A lot of African villages in East Demerara benefited from the work that the Christian churches did. And I suppose the same happens in other areas of the country. I do know that because of the huge migrant situation. I don't want to call it a migrant problem, but I think the word problem would not be out of place. The huge migrant problem, particularly in the Barimu Waini, where a lot of indigent Amerindians have crossed over. The Christian church has stepped forward to provide, relief. But when you talk about 30,000, people coming into the country, no one church could bear the burden of feeding those people and providing housing. So some churches collaborate with Food to the Poor and other charitable organizations, but I think that generally speaking, villages have benefited more than urban areas from the relief work that the churches are capable of delivering. I think Guyana would have been a much different place historically without the Christian church. I think even now we would be a more lawless society without Christianity, and I think we are a better people, a better nation because of Christianity.
All right, President Granger, there this evening, speaking about Christianity and the fact that the public has never failed to acknowledge and appreciate the central role played by the Christian church in primary and secondary education and in enhancing human development in the post-emancipation and pre-independence era. Uh, President Granger, as always, we're thankful for your time here on AWI, Anansi Web Education. And as we're preparing to usher in, it's Christmas season,
Yes, Advent.
Yeah, like Guyana, like I recall growing up, we had Easter season, right? This is Easter term, Christmas term, but now they have summer term, Thanksgiving term, all sort of things now in Guyana, all sort of things. All right, well, it's our turn to term to wrap up tonight's program, and it's been an interesting topic. While we were talking about the churches and so forth, and you said the more, churches with excitement, it reminds me of when I went to a Clapham church, as they would say, in Linden, right on Bornham Drive there, opposite the Dutchy Boat Landing or the Adams Boat Landing and so forth. As a little boy, I used to love that church because I had my experiences with Kingdom Hall and so forth. And the Kingdom Hall, Jehovah's Witnesses, they were very quiet whenever I attended the Kingdom Hall at number 35 Village on the quarantine. And for those of you who don't know, 35 Village is right after Tallergy and right before Brighton and Evesham and Epsom and so forth. So number 35 Kingdom Hall, we used to go in the Kingdom Hall and sit quietly. And they would say, in order for me to get an excitement, the brother of the congregation would ask, is there anyone who would like to read Proverbs 3:5? We see Brother Mark there. That was my excitement. Read Proverbs 3:5. Lean not on thine own under, and I felt good. But the experience now with the Clapham Church in Linden, it was fun for me. Clap, dance up, jump up, go tell my enemy I am under the rock, and then the drumming, and man, that was excitement. Sorry, I had to say that because it was excitement. What was your visit like at that church at Philippi? Because you love Philippi too. You went to that church.
Yes, I went there again. As I pointed out, I I'm Anglican. I'm an Anglican, and Anglicanism, it's really a continuum. I think on the one side you have persons who are closer to the Methodists, on the traditional Protestant, and there's some which are what they call high church, which are closer to the Roman Catholics. They have a lot of incense and statuary and lace and that type of thing. But I came from the low church, and Christ Church is the lowest of the low in the sense that it was more fundamental. It never tolerated some of the fanciness of other churches. It was closer to the Presbyterian. In my day, it was painted in like varnished wood, and the vestments of the clergy were very simple. People avoided lace and some of these fashionable forms of apparel. But I would say that I am closer to the left wing, if you could call it, of the Anglican Church, and I'm not inclined towards some of the more exciting services. I prefer to have something more formal and more contemplative. Um, I can get my excitement elsewhere, but I think when I go to church, I expect something else. So I feel that by going to Philippi, yes, some people like that type of music and the drumming and and so on. But I go for my music elsewhere. But, my personal disposition is different to what I see in some of those Pentecostal churches. But I appreciate what people look for, and I know a lot of people have left the traditional churches to go to those Pentecostal churches. Well, it's good for them, but I think the Bible is very complex. Christianity is very complex, and sometimes excitement can't take the place of education, if I can put it like that. Entertainment cannot take the place of education, and I think the educational role of the church is more important to me. That's personal.
Yep. Thank you so much, President Granger. Appreciate your time as always. Please give our regards to your beautiful wife, former First Lady, Sandra Granger, and continue with your kitchen garden. We're still waiting. Hopefully by Christmas time, we'll get some photographs of that garden. Hopefully. If not, we'll just ask somebody to snap some photos. Maybe Mrs. Granger will do some snapping of that photo for us. But thank you so much for your time, though, sir. Appreciate it.
Always a pleasure, and I would like to offer season's greetings to all of your viewers and listeners to this program, the Anansi Web Education, and to assure them that we will be continuing throughout the Christmas season to bring them, programs which are relevant to the spirit of Christmas. So thank you and good night.
Thank you so much, too, again, and good night to all of you. God bless. See you next week, same place, same time, right here on 107.1 FM.
On to the market, them a go. For their morning, the day is dawning. For Catacrow to give the villagers a warning. Rise and shine, the birds them a sing. All animal take turn as them join in the waking. Catacrow, Dagaba, donkey bray, horse and they even duckakwa. Catacrow, Dagaba, donkey bray, horse and they even duckakwa. Come and hear this sweet story that tell the people about life in the country. All day a back now, me now a come home. Inaga jackass yard to fetch the load.